April 18, 1945. The small farming town of Harzburg, Germany, lay under a thin veil of morning mist as the sound of American tanks echoed through cobblestone streets. For the women of the Auxiliary Corps stationed at the local Luftwaffe Communications Center, their training had prepared them for capture, torture, and even execution, but not for what would actually happen when the Americans arrived. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how propaganda crumbled in the face of reality, and how a simple meal served by those deemed inferior would forever change the worldview of 27 German women who had spent their lives believing in the Reich's racial doctrine. Lieutenant Margarete Weber stood at attention beside the radio equipment, her fingers still hovering over the dials she had been using to send the final coded message to Berlin. The 32-year-old career servicewoman had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1941 after teaching mathematics at a girls' school in Munich. Her dark blonde hair was pulled tightly in a regulation bun beneath her cap, her uniform still impeccable, despite 3 days without sleep. The past 72 hours had been a blur of chaos as Wehrmacht forces retreated eastward, leaving the communications center to destroy sensitive documents and prepare for the inevitable. "They're coming up Bahnhofstrasse now," announced Corporal Elsa Hoffmann, the youngest of their unit at barely 19. Her pale face pressed against the window, watching the first American reconnaissance vehicles appear at the far end of the street. "There are colored soldiers with them," she whispered, her voice tight with the fear that had been drilled into them through years of propaganda films depicting American Negro troops as savage rapists and murderers. Gerda Schmidt, their sergeant and commanding officer, a stern woman who had served in the Auxiliary Corps since its formation, sharply pulled Elsa away from the window. "Remember your training," she hissed. "Name, rank, service number, nothing more. If they separate us, maintain discipline. Do not show fear. They use fear to break you." The 27 women of Communications Unit 317 had received extensive indoctrination on what to expect upon capture. The propaganda ministry had been especially vivid in describing the threat posed by America's integrated military, emphasizing that Negro soldiers had been deliberately placed in forward units to terrorize the German civilian population. Weber looked around at her colleagues, women who had served loyally, many of whom had lost husbands and brothers on the Eastern Front. Traudl Keller, their technician specialist, clutched the small cyanide capsule that some of them had been issued. Weber gently placed her hand over Traudl's, shaking her head slightly. "Not yet," she said quietly. "That's a final measure. We are military personnel and entitled to proper treatment under the Geneva Convention." Though she spoke with authority, Weber's own heart raced with uncertainty. The Americans had a reputation for observing the conventions of war, but the Russians to the east did not. Their unit had processed enough reports from the collapsing Eastern Front to know what happened to German women captured by Soviet forces. The Americans were their best hope now, even with the terrifying prospect of their Negro troops. The building shuddered as something heavy, likely a tank, rolled to a stop outside. Commands in English echoed through the street, followed by the sound of boots on the steps. The women instinctively straightened their uniforms and stood in formation as the door burst open. "U.S. Army! Hands up! Hände hoch!" The first soldiers through the door were white, weapons raised, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. Behind them came 2 black soldiers, their expressions professional and focused. Weber noticed immediately how well-equipped they were, their uniforms clean and complete, their boots sturdy, their weapons well-maintained. It stood in stark contrast to the increasingly ragged appearance of German forces in recent months. Captain Thomas Miller of the 761st Tank Battalion surveyed the room of German female personnel, surprised to find the communications center staffed entirely by women. He holstered his sidearm and spoke in slow, deliberate German. "You are now prisoners of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Is there an officer in charge?" Sergeant Schmidt stepped forward, her chin high. "Feldwebel Gerda Schmidt, Luftwaffe Auxiliary Communications Unit 317. The American captain nodded. "Captain Miller, United States Army. Your unit is now under American military custody. You will be transported to a processing center. Gather only essential personal items. No equipment, no weapons. You have 10 minutes. As the women collected their belongings under guard, Weber observed the American soldiers with cautious curiosity. The black soldiers maintained professional distance, speaking only to their fellow Americans. Their discipline contradicted everything she had been told. Where were the animals they had been warned about? These men behaved with the same military bearing as their white counterparts. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, a 24-year-old from Detroit, who had been working as an auto factory worker before the war, stood guard at the doorway. He noticed the German women avoiding eye contact, some visibly trembling when they had to walk past him. He had seen this reaction before in other German towns, the mix of fear and contempt that came from years of Nazi racial propaganda. But there was something different about these women. They were military, trained to maintain composure, yet they seemed more terrified of him than the civilian women in the villages they had liberated. The Americans efficiently processed the prisoners, searching them for weapons and documents. Weber surrendered her service pistol, a Walter PPK she had rarely fired outside of training, and watched as the Americans systematically disconnected and examined the communication equipment. One of the American sergeants, a white man named Cooper, discovered their code books hidden beneath a false floor panel. "Well, well," he said in English, not expecting to be understood. "Looks like we hit the jackpot. Intelligence is going to want to see these." Weber, who had studied English literature at university before the war, understood perfectly but kept her face impassive. The code books were outdated. They had been using new encryption protocols for weeks, but the Americans wouldn't know that. As they were led outside, Weber was struck by the sheer volume of American equipment passing through the town. Trucks, tanks, jeeps, an endless procession of vehicles, all well-maintained and seemingly brand new. The contrast with Germany's dwindling, often cobbled-together vehicles was stark. How could they have been told the Americans were on the verge of defeat when they could field such overwhelming resources? The women were loaded into 2 large transport trucks. Weber found herself seated across from Private Johnson, who was assigned to guard their transport. For the first hour of the journey, no one spoke. The German women sat rigid, eyes downcast, occasionally whispering among themselves. Weber caught fragments of their concerns, fears about where they were being taken, whether they would be separated, whether the stories about American captivity were true. It was Elsa who finally broke down, her composure cracking as the truck hit a pothole. "Are they taking us to one of their camps?" she whispered to Weber, tears in her eyes. "Will they let the Negroes have us?" Weber wished she had a reassuring answer, but the truth was she didn't know. The propaganda had been specific about the fate of women captured by American forces, especially those with Negro units. But the behavior of the soldiers thus far contradicted everything they had been told to expect. After 3 hours on increasingly rural roads, the trucks finally stopped. When the canvas flaps opened, Weber saw they had arrived at what appeared to be a hastily established prisoner processing facility, a collection of large tents surrounded by fencing in what had once been a farm field. Captain Miller addressed them again as they disembarked. "This is a temporary processing center. You will be registered, given medical examinations, and provided with food and shelter. Tomorrow you will be transported to a permanent POW facility. Any questions?" Sergeant Schmidt asked the only question that mattered to them. "Will we be kept together as a unit?" "Yes," Miller replied. "Female military personnel are housed separately, but as intact units when possible." The women were led to a large tent containing simple cots with blankets. Each was given a towel, soap, and a card with a prisoner number. The processing was efficient and impersonal, fingerprints, photographs, forms to complete. Medical personnel, all women, conducted basic health examinations. To the Germans' surprise, they were treated with professional courtesy throughout. Weber observed the operation with growing confusion. Where was the mistreatment they had been warned to expect? The American personnel, white, black, and even some Asian soldiers she noticed working in the administration tent, all performed their duties with the same professional efficiency. Night fell, and the women settled onto their cots, speaking in hushed tones about their situation. Most were still in shock, unable to process the rapid collapse of everything they had believed secure just days ago. "They're just waiting," whispered Troudel Keller, still clutching her small bag of personal items as though it were a lifeline. They behave correctly when their officers are watching, but later, when we're moved again. Weber wasn't so sure. Did you see their supply lines? The amount of equipment they have. They're not a desperate army. Desperate armies loot and rape. These Americans have discipline because they're winning decisively. The Führer said America was on the brink of collapse, countered Hilde Becker, one of the radio operators, that their economy couldn't sustain a two-front war. Weber had seen enough to question this assertion, but kept her doubts to herself. Defeatist talk was still dangerous, even among prisoners. Morning came with the sound of activity outside their tent. The women had slept in their uniforms, unwilling to make themselves vulnerable in a camp run by the enemy. When Sergeant Schmidt was informed they would be receiving breakfast, the women prepared themselves for the meager rations they expected in captivity. What happened next would alter the course of their understanding more dramatically than any battle or bombing could have done. The tent flap opened, and 3 black American soldiers entered, pushing carts loaded with food. The German women instinctively drew back, some gasping audibly. Weber felt her own heart rate quicken, years of propaganda flashing through her mind, despite her intellectual attempt to remain objective. "Breakfast for you ladies," announced the lead soldier, in accented but understandable German. "We got hot coffee, powdered eggs, bacon and bread with jam. Come up one at a time, please." The women remained frozen in place, staring at the African-American soldiers, with expressions ranging from terror to disbelief. The scent of real coffee, not the ersatz coffee made from roasted grains that Germans had been drinking for years, filled the tent, along with the forgotten aroma of bacon. Sergeant Schmidt finally broke the silence, stepping forward with military bearing. "Feldwebel Gerda Schmidt, prisoner 31701, she stated formally before accepting a tray. Weber watched as Schmidt inspected the food with suspicion. The portions were generous by any standard, but especially striking compared to the increasingly meager rations they had subsisted on in recent months. Real eggs, real meat. White bread that wasn't stretched with sawdust. One by one, the other women followed Schmidt's example, each approaching cautiously to receive their trays. Weber noticed that the American soldiers maintained a professional demeanor throughout, showing no reaction to the obvious discomfort of the German women. When her turn came, Weber looked directly at the soldier serving her, Staff Sergeant William Davis from Georgia, according to the name tape on his uniform. "You made this food?" she asked in English, surprising him. Davis recovered quickly. "Yes, ma'am, I was a cook before the war. Army figured I might as well cook here, too." Weber nodded, accepting her tray. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling strange in this context. Davis seemed momentarily taken aback by the courtesy, then nodded. "You're welcome. There's more if anyone wants seconds." The idea of seconds, of extra food freely offered, was so foreign that several women exchanged glances of disbelief. They had been on strict rationing for years, with portions growing smaller as the war progressed. Even as auxiliary military personnel, their rations had been increasingly reduced to prioritize frontline combat units. Back at her cot, Weber inspected her food carefully before taking a tentative bite of the scrambled eggs. They were made from powder, but still recognizably eggs, something she hadn't tasted in nearly a year. The bread was soft and white, the bacon salty and rich. The coffee, though, was the true shock. Real coffee with sugar and even a small amount of condensed milk. Around her, the other women ate silently, many with tears in their eyes at the simple pleasure of a full, nutritious meal. Some still hesitated, suspicion deeply ingrained. "It could be drugged," Troudel whispered, poking at her bacon. Hilde Becker, already halfway through her meal, rolled her eyes. "To what end? They have us as prisoners already." "To make us compliant," Troudel insisted, "for interrogation." Weber had already decided to trust her observations over her fears. "I think, if they wanted to break us, they would starve us, not feed us the best meal we've had in years." As they ate, Weber noticed Private Johnson and another black soldier she hadn't seen before standing guard at the tent entrance. They conversed quietly, occasionally glancing at the German women. Weber strained to hear their conversation, her English skills allowing her to catch fragments. "Still looking at us like we're going to eat them instead of the food," Johnson was saying with a slight shake of his head. Can you blame them? His companion replied. After all that Nazi propaganda, some of these ladies probably never even seen a colored person before, except in those nasty films. Yeah, well, they better get used to it. Way I hear it, they're being transferred to a permanent camp tomorrow where the kitchen staff is mostly colored. This information sent Weber's mind racing. If the Americans were placing black personnel in charge of crucial operations like food preparation for prisoners, it suggested a level of trust and integration that contradicted everything the German propaganda had claimed about America's treatment of its Negro population. After breakfast, the women were permitted to wash using basins of clean water, provided outside the tent. A simple courtesy that nonetheless reinforced the surprising level of organization in this temporary facility. Weber took the opportunity to observe more of the camp's operations. What struck her most was the easy interaction between white and black American soldiers. They worked alongside each other, ate together, and seemed to communicate without the racial tension she had been taught was tearing American society apart. Certainly, she noticed that most officers were white, but even this hierarchy seemed more complex than German propaganda had suggested. As she returned to the tent, Weber passed the field kitchen where their breakfast had been prepared. Several black soldiers worked efficiently under the direction of a heavy-set white sergeant. The abundance of food supplies stacked in crates made her stop and stare. Cases of canned goods, sacks of flour and sugar, cartons of powdered eggs and milk. More food than she had seen in one place for years. Staff Sergeant Davis noticed her looking and paused in his work. Something wrong with breakfast? He asked, wiping his hands on his apron. Weber shook her head. No, it was very good. I was just... She struggled to find the words in English. There is so much. Davis seemed to understand the unspoken comparison. Yeah, we don't have rationing like you folks. Not for the basics, anyway. Some luxury items are hard to come by, but America's got plenty of food. Nobody goes hungry. The casual statement landed like a bombshell in Weber's carefully constructed understanding of the world. German propaganda had consistently reported food shortages in America, claiming their economy was collapsing under wartime pressure. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, not just in words but in the undeniable reality of the food itself. You're one of them officers, right? The women officers? Davis asked, changing the subject. Lieutenant, Weber confirmed. Communications specialist. Davis nodded. Thought so. Way you carry yourself. We got women in our forces too, though not in combat roles yet. My sister's a nurse with a MASH unit in Italy. This casual mention of a black woman serving as a military nurse added another crack to Weber's understanding. The Nazis had portrayed American Negroes as barely civilized, certainly not educated professionals like nurses or skilled cooks. Before Weber could respond, Captain Miller approached. Lieutenant Weber, a moment of your time. She followed the American officer to a small table set up outside the administration tent. A translator sat waiting, though Miller waved him away when Weber indicated she spoke English. We're processing your unit for transfer to a permanent facility tomorrow, Miller explained. As the highest-ranking officer among the women, you'll be responsible for maintaining discipline within your group. Any issues should come through you to the camp administration. Weber nodded, familiar with military hierarchy even in captivity. I've also been asked to inform you that we've captured documents from your communications center that will be valuable to our intelligence division. Cooperation with any questions regarding those documents would be noted favorably. Weber maintained her composure. I understand my obligations under the Geneva Convention, Captain. Name, rank, service number. Miller seemed unsurprised by her response. Of course, just delivering the message. He shuffled some papers. We've also had reports from some of your women about medical concerns. 3 have requested examination for respiratory issues, likely from working in that basement facility with poor ventilation. Our medical team will see them this afternoon. The matter-of-fact way the Americans addressed the health needs of prisoners was yet another surprise. Weber had expected medical attention to be withheld or used as leverage for cooperation. As their conversation concluded, a commotion at the camp entrance caught their attention. A convoy of trucks was arriving, bringing more prisoners, male Wehrmacht soldiers captured during the same advance that had taken Weber's unit. What happened next would become one of the most profound moments in Weber's evolving understanding of the American forces. As the German soldiers were processed, a group of wounded men was immediately directed to the medical tent. Weber watched as two black medics rushed to assist a particularly badly injured officer, working quickly and professionally to stabilize him before white doctors arrived. The German officer, despite his pain, recoiled from the black medic's touch, spitting out racial slurs in German that made Weber flinch with their viciousness. The medics, though clearly understanding the tone, if not the specific words, continued their work without reaction, saving the life of a man who despised them for the color of their skin. Captain Miller noticed Weber watching the scene. "Something wrong, Lieutenant?" Weber struggled to articulate the complex emotions the scene evoked. "They help him even though he—" She trailed off. Miller's expression hardened slightly. "They're medics. That's their job. The wounded man's attitude doesn't change their duty." "In Germany, we would not." Weber stopped herself, suddenly uncertain what she was trying to say. That in Germany, they would not treat enemy wounded. That they would not allow black men to touch Aryan bodies. Both statements felt suddenly shameful when confronted with the simple humanity of the medics doing their job. Miller seemed to understand her unfinished thought. "Your people have been told a lot of things about mine, Lieutenant Weber. I suggest you use your time as a POW to observe what's true and what isn't." With that, he returned to his duties, leaving Weber to contemplate his words. The remainder of the day passed with the mechanical efficiency of military routine. The women of Unit 317 stayed together in their tent, processing their situation and speculating about what awaited them at the permanent camp. Some, like Traudel and Elsa, remained convinced that worse treatment was coming. Others, like Weber and increasingly Sergeant Schmidt, were beginning to question the disconnect between what they were experiencing and what they had been told to expect. Dinner that evening was served by the same black soldiers who had brought breakfast, though this time the women's reaction was less overtly fearful. The meal consisted of beef stew with vegetables, more of the white bread, and even a simple dessert of canned peaches. Once again, the portions were generous, the quality surprisingly good for field kitchen fare. Weber noticed Sergeant Schmidt studying Staff Sergeant Davis as he served the food. After receiving her tray, Schmidt hesitated, then asked, "Where do you come from in America?" Davis seemed surprised by the question. "Georgia, ma'am, little town called Macon." "And you were a cook there too?" "Yes, ma'am. My family runs a restaurant. Been cooking since I was tall enough to reach the stove." This simple biographical detail, a black family owning a business, passing down skills through generations, conflicted with the image of American Negroes as an underclass without education or opportunity. Schmidt nodded thoughtfully and returned to her cot. Weber noticed her commanding officer's expression had shifted from rigid hostility to something more contemplative. After the meal, Weber overheard a conversation between two of the younger women that captured the growing cognitive dissonance affecting them all. "They can't be the same ones we were warned about," Elsa was saying quietly. "Perhaps the Americans keep their worst Negro units away from prisoner camps." "Or perhaps what we were told wasn't true," replied Anna Müller, a radio operator who had trained at the same Berlin facility as Elsa. "Careful," Elsa warned, glancing around nervously. "That kind of talk is still dangerous." Anna gave a bitter laugh. "We're already prisoners, Elsa. What more can they do to us now?" "It's not them I'm worried about," Elsa whispered. "There are still loyal believers among us, women who might report defeatist talk even here." Weber pretended not to hear, but she understood Elsa's caution. Years of conditioning didn't disappear overnight, even when confronted with contradictory evidence. The habit of watching one's words, of suspecting informers everywhere, was deeply ingrained in German society under the Third Reich. That night, as the women prepared for sleep, they received another unexpected courtesy. Clean nightgowns were distributed, along with basic toiletries. The simple items represented a level of humane treatment none had anticipated in captivity. "Why would they treat us so well?" Traudel wondered aloud as they changed. "We are the enemy." "Geneva Convention," Hilda suggested. "They're following the rules of war." Germany signed the Geneva Convention too, Weber pointed out quietly, yet we all know how Russian prisoners are treated in our camps. This uncomfortable truth hung in the air. Every woman in the unit had processed reports from the Eastern Front. They knew the conditions in German camps for Soviet POWs violated every principle of the convention their country had signed. That's different, Traudl insisted. Russians aren't really people. They're Bolshevik animals. Weber had once accepted such distinctions without question. Now she found herself asking, if they had been wrong about Americans, what else had they been wrong about? Morning arrived with the news that they would be transported to the permanent POW facility after breakfast. The meal, once again served by the black kitchen staff, included a luxury none of the women had tasted in years: real oranges, one for each prisoner. Weber watched as her colleagues held the fruit, some with tears in their eyes at the simple pleasure long denied them. Elsa actually smiled as she peeled her orange, the fresh citrus scent bringing back memories of childhood Christmases when such treats were still available. As they ate, Captain Miller arrived with their transfer orders. "You'll be moving out in 30 minutes. Gather your personal items. The permanent facility has better accommodations and an established routine for female military prisoners." Weber noticed a new face accompanying Miller. A black woman in a U.S. Army uniform with lieutenant's bars. Miller introduced her. "This is Lieutenant Vivian Taylor from the Women's Army Corps. She'll be escorting your unit to the permanent facility and handling the transfer of female prisoners." The sight of a black woman officer, poised, professional, and clearly educated, struck Weber as perhaps the most profound contradiction yet to everything Nazi ideology had taught about racial hierarchy. Lieutenant Taylor spoke perfect German, with only a slight accent, as she explained the transfer procedures. "You'll be transported by truck to a facility near Frankfurt that has been designated for female military personnel. The journey will take approximately 4 hours. Toilet breaks will be provided every 2 hours. You will be housed together as a unit. Any questions?" Sergeant Schmidt asked about letter-writing privileges and received confirmation that they would be permitted to send messages home through the Red Cross once at the permanent facility, yet another adherence to the Geneva Convention that they had not expected. As they prepared to depart, Weber found herself near Staff Sergeant Davis, who was collecting the breakfast trays. On impulse, she addressed him. "Thank you for the meals. They were very good." Davis nodded, accepting the compliment professionally. "Just doing my job, ma'am." Weber hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since their arrival. "Sergeant Davis, may I ask you something? Why do you serve a country that—" She struggled to phrase the question tactfully. "That doesn't always treat folks like me equal." Davis finished for her, his expression suggesting he'd heard the question before. "It's still my country, and it's changing. Before the war I couldn't have been a sergeant, couldn't have given orders to white soldiers. Now I do both. Every day we serve proves what we can do." Weber considered this. "But after, when you return home, things won't go back to how they were," Davis said with quiet certainty. "Too many of us have served, shown what we're capable of. Too many white soldiers have fought alongside us, depended on us. America's not perfect, but at least it can change, can become better." He gave her a pointed look. "Can your Germany say the same?" The question lingered with Weber as they boarded the trucks for transfer. The women were quieter now, the initial shock of capture giving way to a more reflective state. Many were processing not just their status as prisoners, but the uncomfortable contradictions between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing. The journey passed without incident. The American guards professional throughout. When they stopped for the promised breaks, the women noticed they were given the same field rations as their guards, more evidence of equal treatment. They arrived at the permanent facility by mid-afternoon. It had previously been a German military barracks, now repurposed as a POW camp. The women's section was a separate building with its own fenced perimeter, offering a degree of privacy from the male prisoners housed elsewhere in the complex. The processing was similar to the temporary facility, but more comprehensive. Each woman was issued prison uniforms, though allowed to keep certain personal items. They were assigned bunks in a dormitory-style room, given a thorough orientation to camp rules and schedules, and informed of work assignments that would begin the following day. What struck Weber immediately was that the camp kitchen was, as Private Johnson had mentioned, staffed primarily by black American soldiers. The cookhouse they passed during their tour was a hive of activity, with black personnel efficiently preparing the evening meal for the entire camp population. Their first dinner at the permanent facility further challenged their expectations. The food was simple, but nutritious and plentiful, a stark contrast to the increasingly meager rations in Germany. Weber noted that they received the same meals as their guards, another adherence to Geneva Convention standards that German camps rarely followed with their prisoners. After dinner, the women gathered in their dormitory, speaking more freely now that they had begun to adjust to their new reality. The conversations revealed the evolving perspectives within the group. "Did you see how many of them are working in the kitchen?" Hilda commented. "The Negro soldiers, I mean, and they're the ones preparing all the food." "What are you suggesting?" Troudel asked suspiciously. "Just that if the Americans didn't trust them, they wouldn't put them in charge of feeding everyone, would they? Including their own white soldiers." Elsa, who had been one of the most fearful initially, nodded. "And that woman officer who brought us here, Lieutenant Taylor. She spoke better German than our English instructor at the training academy." "They're trying to impress us," Troudel insisted, though her conviction seemed to be wavering. "To make us think America is some paradise of equality, so we'll cooperate." Sergeant Schmidt, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "I don't think they care what we think, Troudel. They're winning the war without our approval." The blunt assessment silenced the group momentarily. It was the first time their commanding officer had openly acknowledged the reality of Germany's defeat. "What will happen to Germany now?" Anna asked quietly, voicing the question they had all been avoiding. No one had an answer. Their future, like that of their homeland, was now in the hands of their captors. The following morning brought the beginning of their new routine as long-term prisoners. After breakfast, again prepared by the Black Kitchen staff and of the same surprising quality as previous meals, they were assigned work details. Weber, along with Sergeant Schmidt and 4 others with administrative experience, was assigned to the camp's records office. The work was straightforward: filing, organizing, and translating documents related to prisoner processing. Their supervisors were a mix of white and black American personnel, all of whom treated the German prisoners with professional courtesy. Other women from their unit were assigned to the laundry, the medical facility, those with nursing training, or the camp maintenance crew. The work was not punitive, but rather seemed designed to keep the prisoners occupied and contributing to the camp's operation, another surprise in their evolving understanding of American detention policies. During her first shift in the records office, Weber worked alongside Staff Sergeant James Wilson, a black soldier from Philadelphia who had been a high school teacher before the war. His job was to review the German prisoners' service records for intelligence value, with Weber translating documents that contained technical military terminology. "You read English very well," Wilson commented after observing her work for several hours. "Where did you learn?" "University," Weber replied. "I studied English literature before the war. Shakespeare, Dickens, Hemingway." Wilson smiled. "Hemingway's one of my favorites. I taught A Farewell to Arms to my senior students." The casual mention of a black man teaching literature to American high school students, a position of intellectual authority and respect, added another contradiction to Weber's understanding. In that moment, she realized she was having a collegial conversation about literature with someone she had been taught was barely capable of civilized thought. "May I ask you something, Sergeant Wilson?" Weber ventured during their lunch break when they were relatively alone. Wilson nodded, setting aside his sandwich. "Go ahead." "How is it possible that you work so closely with white soldiers?" "Our information was that Negroes in America were strictly segregated, especially in the military." Wilson considered the question thoughtfully. "The Army is still segregated in many ways. Most combat units are either all white or all colored. But things have been changing during the war. Necessity has a way of breaking down barriers." He gestured around them. "This camp needs people who can speak German, who understand military records, who can cook for hundreds of people. If the best qualified person for a job is colored, they're increasingly putting that person in the role regardless of old policies. "And after the war?" Weber asked. "Will it go back to how it was?" Wilson's expression grew more serious. "Some will try to make it so. But too much has changed. Too many of us have proven ourselves. Too many white Americans have seen what we can do when given the chance." He studied her for a moment. "Not so different from what's happening to you right now, is it? Seeing with your own eyes that what you were told about us wasn't true." The parallel was uncomfortably apt. Weber had no response. In the weeks that followed, the women of Unit 317 settled into the routine of prisoner life. The conditions remained humane, the food plentiful, and their treatment correct. Letters from home began to arrive via the Red Cross, bringing news of family members and the chaotic conditions in defeated Germany. The interactions between the German women and the Black American personnel continued to evolve. The initial fear gave way to cautious curiosity, and eventually to a grudging respect among most of the women. A few, like Traudl, maintained their rigid adherence to Nazi racial ideology, but they became increasingly isolated within the group. One afternoon in late May, about a month after their capture, Weber was sorting mail in the records office when Wilson approached her with a small package. "Special delivery for your unit," he explained, "from Staff Sergeant Davis at the processing center. Apparently you ladies made an impression." Weber opened the package to find a note and several small cloth bags. The note read simply, "Thought you might miss real coffee. Share with your unit. Staff Sergeant W. Davis, 761st Quartermaster Corps." The bags contained genuine coffee beans, a luxury even American soldiers didn't always have easy access to. The thoughtful gesture from a man who, by all Nazi teaching, should have been incapable of such consideration, struck Weber deeply. That evening, the women gathered in their dormitory as Hilda, who had worked in her father's cafe before the war, prepared the coffee using a makeshift filtration system constructed from available materials. The rich aroma filled their living space, evoking memories of pre-war Germany and normalcy. As they sipped the precious beverage, conversation turned to their evolving understanding of their American captors, particularly the black soldiers who continued to confound their expectations. "Did you know Lieutenant Taylor was a university professor before the war?" Anna told the group. "She taught German language and literature at Howard University. She told me it's a Negro university in Washington, all Negro professors and students." Such information would have been dismissed as propaganda months earlier. Now, having met Taylor and observed her evident education and refinement, it merely added to their reconstructed understanding of American society. "Sergeant Wilson's son is studying engineering," Weber added. "He showed me a photograph yesterday. The boy is at some technical college in Pennsylvania." Sergeant Schmidt nodded thoughtfully. "The cook in the officers' mess, Roberts, told me his daughter is training to be a nurse, following his wife, who served as a nurse in the last war." Each such detail represented another contradiction to the monolithic portrayal of American Negroes they had been taught. The reality was more complex, more human than Nazi ideology had allowed for. Not all the women were ready to abandon their previous beliefs, however. Traudl, who had remained largely isolated from the Americans by choice, shook her head dismissively. "These are exceptions. Selected examples they're showing us deliberately. You can find a few educated ones anywhere. It doesn't change the natural order." "And what is the natural order, Traudl?" Weber asked quietly. "The one where we lost the war to these people we were told were inferior?" Traudl had no answer, retreating into sullen silence. As June arrived, bringing warm weather, the camp routine expanded to include supervised outdoor recreation, a concession to maintaining the health of long-term prisoners. The women were permitted to walk the perimeter of their compound each evening after dinner, a simple pleasure that nonetheless improved morale considerably. During one such walk, Weber found herself alongside Sergeant Schmidt, the two officers naturally falling into step together. "What will you do when we're eventually released?" Weber asked, the question of their future beginning to occupy more of her thoughts as the initial shock of captivity faded. Schmidt considered this. "I don't know. Return to Berlin if anything remains of it. Try to find my sister and her children. Beyond that." She shrugged. "Germany will need to be rebuilt. There will be work for those willing to do it. Do you think about what we believed?" Weber asked carefully. About what we've seen here. Schmidt was silent for several paces before responding. I think about little else, Lieutenant. 12 years I served the Reich, believed everything we were told, repeated it to others. She gestured toward the kitchen building where several black soldiers were visible, working on meal preparation. If they lied about these men, what else did they lie about? It was the most direct acknowledgement of their shifting worldview that Weber had heard from her commanding officer. The admission seemed to cost Schmidt something, her expression tightening with the pain of certainty crumbling. I keep thinking about what Sergeant Davis said, Weber admitted, about America changing, becoming better, whether Germany could do the same. We'll have to, Schmidt said grimly. After what we've done, what we've allowed to be done, we'll have no choice but to become something different. The conversation might have continued, but they were interrupted by sounds of commotion from the main camp beyond their fence, raised voices, vehicle engines, a general increase in activity. Something's happening, Schmidt observed, her military instincts alert. They learned the cause at breakfast the following morning. Lieutenant Taylor addressed the women's unit with news that would further alter their understanding of their situation. Ladies, I've been authorized to inform you that Germany signed unconditional surrender terms on May 8th. The war in Europe is officially over. The Nazi regime has been dismantled, and an Allied military government has been established. The announcement, though not entirely unexpected, still landed heavily among the women. For many, it represented the final confirmation of everything they had been processing since their capture. What happens to us now? Sergeant Schmidt asked, her voice steady despite the momentous news. For the immediate future, your status remains unchanged, Taylor explained. As military prisoners, you will continue to be held until repatriation procedures are established. However, there will be some adjustments to camp protocols in light of the official end of hostilities. Those adjustments, they soon learned, included increased male privileges, expanded work options within the camp, and the introduction of re-education programs designed to prepare German prisoners for return to a denazified Germany. The re-education sessions began the following week. The women gathered in the camp's small auditorium, where Lieutenant Taylor introduced the program. These sessions are not mandatory, but are strongly encouraged. They will provide factual information about recent history and current conditions in Germany and the wider world, information that was often unavailable or distorted under the previous government. The first session included documentary film footage that left many of the women in tears. The liberation of concentration camps, the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale, the skeletal survivors offering mute testimony to horrors beyond imagination. Weber watched, numb with shock and growing horror, as the footage showed camps with names that had been whispered about but never acknowledged officially: Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. The scale of death was incomprehensible, the methodical documentation of atrocity damning. Beside her, Sergeant Schmidt sat rigid, her face ashen. "Did you know?" she whispered to Weber. "I heard rumors," Weber admitted, "but I didn't want to believe." "None of us did," Schmidt replied, her voice hollow. It was easier not to ask questions. Not all the women accepted what they were shown. Traudel and a few others walked out of the auditorium, dismissing the footage as American propaganda. But for most, including Weber and Schmidt, the evidence was too overwhelming, too consistent with the pattern of lies they had already begun to recognize. That evening, the mood in the women's dormitory was somber, each prisoner processing what they had learned in her own way. Some wept quietly, others sat in stunned silence. A few, like Traudel, maintained angry denial. Weber found herself unable to sleep, the images from the documentary replaying in her mind. Around midnight, she slipped out of bed and went to the small window that overlooked the main campyard. The night was clear, stars visible above the floodlights that illuminated the compound. She was surprised to see a figure already at the window, Elsa, the youngest of their unit, who had been among the most visibly affected by the footage. "I keep thinking about my brother," Elsa said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was in the SS. He wrote home about special actions in Poland. We were so proud of him." Weber placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder, offering what comfort she could. There were no words adequate to the moment. "The Americans keep feeding us," Elsa continued, her thoughts seemingly disconnected. "They keep treating us like human beings, even after what Germans did. Even the Negro soldiers we were taught to despise treat us better than we treated." She couldn't finish the sentence. The juxtaposition was stark and undeniable. The humane treatment they had received from those deemed racially inferior by Nazi ideology stood in damning contrast to what Germans had done to those they considered beneath them. The re-education sessions continued over the following weeks, covering not only the Holocaust but the broader history of the Nazi period, the systematic propaganda, and the plans for Germany's reconstruction under Allied occupation. The women were also given access to international newspapers and magazines, another window to a wider reality than they had been permitted under the Reich. Work assignments expanded to include more substantive responsibilities. Weber, whose administrative skills and language abilities had made her valuable in the records office, was reassigned to assist with translation for new prisoners arriving from other temporary facilities, being consolidated as the immediate post-war period stabilized. It was in this capacity that she encountered Staff Sergeant Davis again. He had been transferred to their permanent facility as part of the kitchen management team, overseeing food preparation for the entire camp. Their reunion occurred in the camp administration building, where Weber was translating intake forms for new arrivals. Davis entered with requisition papers for the kitchen and recognized her immediately. "Lieutenant Weber," he greeted her, his professional manner unchanged. "Good to see you settled in." Weber found herself genuinely pleased to see the man whose quiet dignity had first challenged her preconceptions. "Sergeant Davis, thank you again for the coffee. It meant a great deal to all of us." Davis nodded, accepting the thanks with the same matter-of-fact manner he approached everything. "Figured you folks hadn't had the real thing in a while. Seemed like a small thing I could do." "Not small to us," Weber assured him. Then, surprising herself with her directness, she added, "I've thought often about what you said at the processing center, about America changing, becoming better. I believe I understand better now what you meant." Davis studied her thoughtfully. "War changes things, changes people, sometimes for the worse, but sometimes it opens eyes too." He gestured vaguely toward the camp around them. "Most of you ladies see us differently now than you did when you arrived, don't you?" Weber nodded, unable to deny the transformation. "We were taught many things that weren't true." "Same happens in America," Davis acknowledged. "Maybe not by government order like here, but people get taught things about colored folks that aren't true. Difference is now there's a chance to change that. War's given us a chance to show what we can do, what we've always been capable of if given the opportunity." The parallel to Germany's situation was clear, a nation that would need to confront its false beliefs and rebuild on a more truthful foundation. As summer progressed into autumn, the women's understanding of their situation and their place in the new post-war order continued to evolve. Letters from home brought news of the difficult conditions in occupied Germany: food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, displaced populations. The contrast with their own relatively comfortable captivity was not lost on them. In September, Lieutenant Taylor gathered the women for an important announcement. "I've been authorized to inform you that repatriation procedures are being established for female auxiliary personnel. As non-combat support staff without direct involvement in war crimes, you have been classified as eligible for early release." The news was met with mixed emotions. While all longed to return home and locate family members, the Germany to which they would return was vastly different from the one they had left. Moreover, many had formed unexpected connections within the camp, not friendships exactly, but working relationships based on mutual respect with their American supervisors, including the black personnel who had so confounded their expectations. "The process will take several weeks," Taylor continued. "You'll be debriefed individually, issued new identification papers for the occupation zones, and provided with ration cards and basic supplies. Transportation will be arranged to your home regions where possible." As the women dispersed to consider this news, Weber found herself alongside Sergeant Schmidt once again. "Are you ready to go back?" Weber asked her commanding officer. Schmidt considered the question seriously. I'm not sure any of us are truly ready, but we have to face what Germany has become, what we allowed it to become. She glanced toward the kitchen building where Davis could be seen directing the dinner preparations. And perhaps take some lessons from what we've learned here. About cooking? Weber asked with a small smile. About seeing people as they are, not as we're told they are, Schmidt replied seriously. The debriefing process began the following week. Each woman was interviewed by intelligence officers interested primarily in their technical knowledge of the communication systems they had operated. Weber, whose position had given her access to higher-level communications, faced more extensive questioning, but maintained her professional military bearing throughout. What surprised her was that her primary debriefer was Lieutenant Taylor, whose expertise in both the German language and military communications made her ideally suited to the role. The black officer conducted the sessions with impeccable professionalism, never using her position of power in the way German interrogators might have done. During their final session, Taylor set aside her formal questionnaire and addressed Weber directly. Off the record, Lieutenant, I'd like to ask you something personal. Weber nodded her permission, curious. When you first arrived at the processing center and saw the Negro personnel, including myself, what did you truly expect would happen? The directness of the question caught Weber off guard, but she recognized it as an opportunity for honesty that might help bridge the gulf of understanding between them. We expected to be mistreated, she admitted. Specifically, we had been told that Negro soldiers were savages who would take advantage of female prisoners, that America used them deliberately to terrorize German civilians. Taylor's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in her eyes at the admission. And now, what would you tell other Germans about your experience? Weber considered carefully. I would tell them that I was wrong, that Germany was wrong, that people cannot be judged by such arbitrary characteristics, that I was treated with more humanity by those I had been taught to despise than many Germans showed to those they considered inferior. Taylor nodded, accepting the answer. When you return to Germany, you'll have an opportunity to share that truth. It won't be easy. Many will prefer to cling to old beliefs rather than face uncomfortable truths, but voices like yours will be essential to building a different Germany. The responsibility inherent in that statement settled heavily on Weber. She had never considered herself political, had joined the auxiliary corps out of a sense of duty rather than ideological fervor. Now, she faced returning to a shattered nation with knowledge that contradicted everything that nation had stood for. In the final days before their scheduled repatriation, the women of Unit 317 prepared for their return to civilian life. They were issued new identity documents, basic civilian clothing to replace their uniforms, and information packets about conditions in their home regions. The night before their departure, Weber found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with uncertainty about the future. She slipped out of the dormitory and walked to the small yard allocated to the women's section, needing fresh air to clear her thoughts. To her surprise, she found Davis there, sitting on a bench and smoking a cigarette. He seemed equally surprised to see her, but gestured to the space beside him in a silent invitation to join him. "Last night, huh?" he said after a moment. "Heading home tomorrow." Weber nodded. "If home still exists. My apartment in Munich was in a district that was heavily bombed." "You'll rebuild," Davis said with simple confidence. "Germans are nothing if not industrious." The compliment, offered without irony by a man she had once been taught to consider subhuman, struck Weber as a fitting encapsulation of her transformed understanding. "Sergeant Davis," she said carefully, "I want to thank you." He raised an eyebrow. "For the coffee. Already did. Not just for that, for—" She struggled to articulate the profound shift he had inadvertently catalyzed. "For serving us that first meal, for showing us through your actions what no words could have convinced us of." Davis seemed to understand what she was trying to say. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes seeing is the only way to believing. Works both ways, you know. Some of our boys had their own ideas about Germans before meeting folks like you, educated, professional women doing technical jobs. Changes how they see things, too." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, each contemplating the strange intersection of their lives in this moment of global transformation. "What will you do when you go back to Georgia?" Weber finally asked. Davis took a final drag on his cigarette before answering. "Pick up where I left off. Family restaurant needs running. But things will be different. I've worn this uniform, had white men salute me, given orders that were followed. Can't unfeel that. Can't go back to pretending I'm less than I am." "No," Weber agreed quietly. "None of us can go back to pretending now." Morning brought the long-anticipated moment of departure. The women gathered their meager belongings and assembled for final processing. They would be transported to Frankfurt, where they would receive their official release papers and transportation vouchers to their respective home regions. As they boarded the trucks that would take them away from the camp that had been their home for over 5 months, Weber found herself looking back at the facility with unexpectedly complex emotions. What had begun as a place of fear and uncertainty had become improbably a site of profound personal transformation. Lieutenant Taylor oversaw their departure, checking off names on her clipboard with military efficiency. When she reached Weber, she paused. "Lieutenant Weber," she said formally, "you're assigned to the first truck, but before you go, Captain Miller would like a word." Weber followed Taylor to where Miller stood with several other officers, including, to her surprise, Sergeant Davis. Miller addressed her directly. "Lieutenant Weber, as the senior officer of your unit, I wanted to personally convey that your group has been exemplary in their conduct as prisoners. That will be noted in your official records." Weber accepted the unexpected compliment with a nod. "Thank you, Captain, and thank you for the correct treatment we received here." Miller seemed almost amused by her thanks for what should have been standard procedure. "We're just following the rules of war, Lieutenant, something all nations should aspire to." The subtle rebuke was not lost on Weber, who had by now fully confronted the reality of how Germany had conducted itself during the conflict. Miller continued, "Sergeant Davis has requested permission to provide a final meal for your unit's journey. Special circumstances, but I've approved it." He gestured to a stack of carefully packed containers being loaded onto the transport trucks. "Seems you ladies made quite an impression on our kitchen staff." Davis stepped forward, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the unusual circumstances. "Just some sandwiches, fruit, and thermoses of coffee for the journey, better than standard travel rations." The thoughtful gesture, once again from a man who by all Nazi teaching should have been incapable of such consideration, provided a fitting conclusion to their experience. "Thank you, Sergeant," Weber said, meeting his eyes directly. "For everything." Davis nodded, understanding the broader meaning behind her words. "Safe journey, Lieutenant. Build something better back there, you hear." As the trucks pulled away from the camp, Weber found herself seated next to Sergeant Schmidt. The women were subdued, each lost in thought about what awaited them in the new Germany. "Open the food packages," Schmidt suggested after they had been traveling for about an hour. "Let's see what Sergeant Davis prepared for us." The meal was simple but thoughtfully assembled. Sandwiches with real meat and cheese, apples, and the promised thermoses of hot coffee with sugar and condensed milk. But what caught Weber's attention was the small note tucked into her package, addressed to her specifically. "Littie Weber, thought you might like this book for the journey home. It helped me understand my country better. Maybe it will help with yours too. W. Davis." Beneath the note was a well-worn paperback copy of Richard Wright's Native Son, a novel Weber had never encountered, but whose title immediately intrigued her. Inside the front cover, Davis had inscribed, "The truth, however painful, is the only path forward, Lee." As the trucks carried them toward Frankfurt, and whatever future awaited them in post-war Germany, Weber carefully opened the book and began to read. The story of Bigger Thomas, his rage, his fear, his humanity denied, offered yet another window into an America far more complex than Nazi propaganda had ever acknowledged. Around her, the other women of Unit 317 ate their meal in contemplative silence, each processing in her own way the journey that had brought them to this moment. Some, like Traudel, remained resistant to the implications of what they had experienced. Others, like young Elsa, had been profoundly changed by the contradictions between what they had been taught and what they had witnessed. For Weber, the path forward was becoming clearer. She would return to a broken Germany with new understanding, not just about Americans or black people or the lies of the Nazi regime, but about the fundamental humanity that transcended the artificial barriers of race and nationality that had led her country to catastrophe. As Frankfurt appeared on the horizon, Weber closed the book, but kept it firmly in her hands, a tangible reminder of unexpected connections formed across the divisions of war and of the transformative power of seeing truth with one's own eyes. She thought of that first morning at the processing center, the shock and fear that had gripped them all when black American soldiers had brought them breakfast. How strange and yet how fitting that such a simple moment, "They let them cook," had been the first crack in a lifetime of carefully constructed lies. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.